challenges that ASEAN faces are spelled out in the EEC blueprint of 2007, the 4 pillars, what needs to be done. That they may accomplish by 2025 or 2030. But in addition to that, there are newer agendas that ASEAN has to handle. And let me conclude by saying a few things on those newer agendas. Strategically, sort of the question is, ASEAN centrality by and large in the region, I think, is established, in my thinking at least. Now the question is, how can ASEAN promote Asia's interest in global fora, G20, the ASEAN Secretary General is invited to that meeting. How can it take Asia's voice to the G20 and try to re-energize G20? G20, as you know, after the first few summits has not been very effective. How can we promote good governance and institutional strengthening in ASEAN? So far, we have the ASEAN Secretariat and other institutions. Okay, so they have done, the ASEAN way and all that. We don't know what really it is. But now with ASEAN having reached a certain level, ASEAN perhaps needs some institutional strengthening, more rules-based. How do we make ASEAN more rules-based? With ASEAN centrality, how do we enhance ASEAN's role in global economic governance? We cannot talk about ASEAN centrality in G20, but how can ASEAN take Asia's voice to the G20? These are some important agenda for ASEAN going forward, even beyond the AEC 2015. What type of modality would ASEAN like to follow in the integration typology, in the integration theory in the longer term? Most certainly not, it will not go for a monetary union, and having seen the experience in Europe, ASEAN will not go for a monetary union.
My apologies, Professor Rana.
What is the longer modality?
My apologies for my interruption. I just want to make sure that all the speakers, panelists...
ASEAN, lead ASEAN and help ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Rana. I would like to go back to Washington, D.C. and hope that Douglas Paul can share with us his thoughts and views on the topic.
Good evening to all of you, and thank you to the Cakrie Center for arranging this opportunity. My job this morning is to talk a little bit about the strategic picture of a positive place. If you look at Japan and China, tensions have been rising increasingly and worrisomely over their contention of the Diaoyudao or Senkaku Islands. That's a current issue of considerable concern in all 3 capitals, Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo. At the same time, we're not quite catching the headlines, but we will soon be noting a spark in tensions on the Korean Peninsula. The leader of North Korea has executed the uncle who oversaw his early years as leader of North Korea and who provided some check on his worst behavior. There is no such check now, and there's an expectation that in the next couple of months, as the normal cycle of exercises begins in South Korea, that North Korea will respond with provocations, nuclear tests, and other kinds of tension. So by comparison with those 2 parts of the world, Southeast Asia looks relatively calm. Nonetheless, we still have a competition for influence in Southeast Asia that's very substantial. China, for 10 years from 1998 to 2008, did a really excellent job of expanding its diplomatic and economic influence in Southeast Asia through very careful diplomacy, investments, trade missions, and the like. From 2008 to the present, China has focused more on its contentions with the region. The claims China has in the South China Sea, which it has been unable to articulate according to international law, have made China's relationship with ASEAN far more complicated. every action that takes place within an ASEAN institution is viewed by Beijing through the lens of the South China Sea. And where does the specific capital, whether it's Phnom Penh or Jakarta or Manila, stand in respect to China's claims to the South China Sea? And how can China persuade them to take its side? This is a festering issue. It's not likely to explode in the way that we worry about on the Korean Peninsula or Japan, Chinese relations, or the Senkaku Diaoyuda Islands, but it does have an eroding influence on Southeast Asia's diplomatic behavior. We're going to see in the course of the next couple of years, I think, according to Chinese announcements that came out in November, a new effort to get back to that 1998-2008 period by Beijing. They've announced a new peripheral diplomacy, which is supposed to be focused on a couple of things. One is a Central Asian revival of the Silk Route, but also a South Asian, Indo-Pacific new kind of Silk Route to the West through expanding trade links and the like. And China has pledged, although not yet articulated in detail, a new ASEAN infrastructure fund, which is intended to put meat on the bones of this idea of a new Silk Route through the Indo-Pacific, and to integrate markets in Southeast Asia with Chinese markets through a range of things, from highways to ports to power lines to gas lines, and in an effort to find growth for the Chinese economy, they will take their tremendous amount of domestic savings and apply it to loans to Southeast Asia to try to build infrastructure. I think that's going to be a source of growth. You can't measure it yet because China hasn't put the hard numbers to paper for public consumption yet, but the ambition is there, and I would expect to see that ambition followed through by the current very forceful regime in Beijing. The United States at this time has articulated a comprehensive rebalance which has economic elements such as the TPP. It has diplomatic elements such as the U.S. getting back involved in a couple of years ago in signing the Southeast Asian Treaty, taking part in the East Asian Summit and the like. And then it has a security dimension, which is to make sure that while the United States draws down its forces in Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Middle East, it does not do so in Asia. It maintains a floor on its position in East Asia. This is all very coherent in form. In fact, the second term of the Obama administration is looking to be more focused on domestic politics and not on events in East Asia. And so follow-through is more in question here in Washington than I would say it is in question in Beijing. Beijing seems to have the resources and the will to go forward. Washington has yet to demonstrate that it has the will. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Douglas Paul. I would like to...
It's great to be at least virtually connected. I think Vikram talked about the main challenges that Southeast Asia faces in the near term, and I would say potentially in the medium term as well, in terms of what's happening in the West, in the high-income economies. As you see a gradual recovery, what you will find as well, and most people are expecting, is the tapering of the extraordinary monetary policies that the U.S. Federal Reserve in particular has been implementing. And what that means for Southeast Asia's economies, and we've seen that in the last few months and even in the last week, is that financial markets, the capital flows, especially portfolio flows to Southeast Asia's economies, will start to moderate. Most of us expect that this will happen in a gradual, manageable fashion, but there is a risk that it will happen more abruptly. And I think that's something to keep in mind. In the near term and the medium term, what this means is that the kind of money that's being flowed, capital that's been flowing into Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asian economies cannot rely on that quite so much as it has as they have in the last few years. Okay? So that means that issues of how to attract the capital that Southeast Asia's economies need for investment, ultimately to create higher value-added jobs, which is what you need to address some of the issues that Vikram raised about growing inequality, or at least a growing sense of being left behind among many segments of Southeast Asian society. So I think there's an agenda there in terms of how do countries like Indonesia and Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand continue to attract the finance that they need for investment, mostly by the private sector, in order to create jobs. So that's number one. Number two is, also Vikram mentioned this, is China. The changing situation in China, as China's growth rate moderates, it's still going to be high by global standards, but as it comes down to the 7% range, the nature of its interaction with its East Asian and Southeast Asian neighbors is likely to change. For countries like Indonesia, the last 5 to 10 years, you've seen dramatic growth in exports to China. Chinese demand for raw materials, for commodities, for intermediate inputs has been a major driver of trade. That may change. I think Doug also mentioned how China itself sees that rebalancing, and so there's going to be a change in the composition of the economic relationships with China, and that's the second item to keep in mind. The third is that how Southeast Asia's economic policymakers manage these changes will be affected by the political transitions that are underway in at least several of the core ASEAN economies, certainly in Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia. And so this is a situation where the economic challenges or the challenges of managing the economic trends that are emerging rest partly in what happens on the political front. And I think this is something that Ibu Dewi and others have mentioned. Where does ASEAN fit into this? I think ASEAN and regional economic integration, whether under the auspices of ASEAN or through some other agreement, I think will offer a way of the region as a collective, especially the Southeast Asian economies, to manage and then really take advantage of the changes that are occurring in the broader external environment.
I would also like to invite Pak Vikram Nehru, since he's the Cakrie Chair for Southeast Asian Studies, to lead the second session and hope to get more details from each of the panelists. Thank you very much. Pak Vikram?
From the Jakarta audience, would that be possible?
That is possible. I think we could do that. If you want to open the floor.
Is it possible to react very quickly
Yes,
to something?
perfectly.
Yeah,
that's possible.
Because Vikram, before I forget, Dr. Rana made a very comprehensive presentation about ASEAN and the concerns, and feeling rather pessimistic about whether ASEAN will be able to live up to its potential and so on. And I've also raised questions, but I'm an optimist by nature, and also looking at Indonesia and ASEAN, we tend to confound expectations. Both Indonesia and ASEAN never do as well as people expect us to do, but we never do as badly as people expect us to do either. So from the Indonesian side, there have been concerns about, and usually in an election year, there's no politicians, as you know, just like in America, no politicians tend to pay too much attention to the outside world. In fact, I haven't heard a single discourse on foreign policy or on the outside world, except fearing the outside world. Politicians tend to be much more inward-looking, tend to be much more populist, and tend to be much more nationalistic. And that could be a danger there in terms of how we engage with the outside world.